Welcome, everyone. I'm Carol Wooden, ASBA's Exhibitions Director, and we're very happy to be able to present today's program, a live studio visit with UK artist Julia Trickey. This studio visit is one of several programs we've hosted with Marin Art and Garden Center in conjunction with the 26th Annual International Exhibition, which is on view out there in California for about 3 more weeks. As the program progresses, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A field, and they'll be answered either during or at the end of the program. Emmeline Nathans, ASBA's Programs Coordinator, will host the Q&A session. As noted on the opening slide, at the close of the program, each registrant will receive a link to view the recording of the webinar. That link will remain live for 2 weeks after today's program. Many of us follow Julia's popular series of online programs in which she hosts well-known botanical artists and other luminaries in associated fields. Now we have a chance to host her and learn more about her own working methods and techniques. Julia has been a celebrated botanical artist and tutor for over 25 years and is particularly known for painting plants at the latter stages of life, including fading flowers, seed heads, and autumn leaves, often showing them larger than life. In her teaching life, she produces resources for aspiring botanical artists and has held workshops in her beautiful home city of Bath, as well as further afield and online. She holds gold and silver gilt medals from the RHS, a Kirsten Bosch gold medal, and several ASBA exhibitions awards. Her work is held in the Shirley Sherwood Collection, the Hunt Institute Collection, the RHS Collection, and the Transylvania Florilegium. We're excited to learn today about Julia's working methods and to see how she readies her plant specimens for painting. She'll walk us through her approach to painting these past prime plant specimens, mixing a range of colors and neutrals in watercolor, approaching roots, and understanding desiccated and translucent elements. So I'm really happy to welcome Julia today.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you that have joined me here in my little studio. Certainly, if it was a live visit, you wouldn't all fit in. In fact, not many of you would fit in, because if I lean back, that's the back of the studio, as it were. And if I lean forward on the desk, that'll be the front. And if I put my hands out twice, that's the width. I've got the smallest room in the house. But it doesn't mean that you can't achieve great things, however small your little studio might be, or however grand it is. So yes, thank you for visiting me for what is called a studio tour. What I'm hoping to do is just show you around a little bit my space and also talk about the equipment that I like to use. I've got a few little observations as we go along on things that I've learnt as a student of botanical art and as a tutor of botanical art. And I also want to share with you my techniques. And just before we go on there, this is the painting that I have currently in the ASBA exhibition, which is of a amaryllis bulb, very much past its best. So what's my space like? If you stood in the corridor and looked through the door, you'd see this plan chest, which was quite an indulgence when we moved house in 2019. But it's great because it holds largely sheets of paper and paintings and prints and all sorts. But even so, I still needed a couple of extra boxes underneath to put other bits of paper and sketchbooks in. I don't think we ever have enough space, do we? Next to the plan chest, I've got my desk with all sorts of bits and pieces on, which I'll tell you about in a minute. Now, my desk is very rarely this clear. Of course, I've cleared it out for the photo, tidied up, but it's not very often like this. It's more usually covered in all sorts of bits and pieces. I'm currently working on a series of drawings for a field study guide. And so I've got to do lots of preparatory drawings before I paint the picture. So all these sort of piles of paper are me sort of sorting out what I'm drawing. And there's also bits and pieces on the desk which are to do with teaching. Okay. Yes, during COVID, the table got particularly messy as I was trying to pre-record tutorials and classes and all sorts of things like that, as you can see. I mean, the camera would only be filming probably the fig and the plate, but all this other detritus and debris was all around. I think it was a bit of a chaotic time, wasn't it, for some of us? Anyway, so this is me with the desk today, and I just wanted to point out a few things. I wouldn't be without these massive studio lights, and they are, some of you will have daylight lights and they'll be a lot more discreet than this. These are massive sort of photographer's studio lights, and they're both on. I've got them both on now because it's evening here in the UK. They don't look pretty, but they're very practical, and they work really well to help me light up the area when I'm filming and teaching, and even just when I'm sitting painting. This desk is wonderful in that you'll see there's some controls here on the left. So this desk is actually one of those that goes up and down. And that's really good because of the different things I'm involved in. Sometimes I might want it a lot lower. Sometimes I might want it to line up with a plan chest if I've got a big project going on. And sometimes if I feel the need to stand up, I can actually raise it up. So again, it doesn't tilt. I know Wendy Hollander's got one that tilts as well. It doesn't tilt, but it's really good in that respect that it goes up and down. This chair, which I'm not actually sitting on today, is supposed to be really good for your back, even though it hasn't got a back to it. So you sit on the stool and then you put your knees on this bit here. So it's supposed to be good for your posture, which I think as botanical artists, quite a lot of us need, don't we? Because we're bent over our desks. I'm actually quite a technophile, which means I quite like technology. I remember when computers were first coming in and someone offered to show my brother their computer, and I was really put out that I didn't get to see it as well. Yeah, so I actually quite love technology, and in this photo you'll see some of the things which are key to what I do day to day. And by the way, this is the light. This light's on here now. This little dot thing, which you might know, is a smart speaker, and I find that really useful just to listen to the radio while I'm painting, or to put some music on, or even just ask it how to spell things, or to add things up for me to do some maths. So yeah, that's my little smart speaker. I've got a stand over here, which is for an iPad, if I need the iPad over my desk. And then more recently, I've updated my visualizer, which is this here, which is basically a webcam on a stick. Although the amount that it costs, it's a bit fancier than that. But it's, well, if you see my desk a bit later, that will be what that's what I'm using now. So all these sort of bits of tech are important to me. Now, you would think as a botanical artist that, as a full-time botanical artist, that I spend a lot of time painting, but actually I spend a lot of time on my laptop. And that might be either because I am preparing presentations like I'm doing now, or the webinars that Carol mentioned. There's a lot of admin to do with that. I might be updating my website, or I might be sorting out Etsy orders, and all these things I could actually get someone else to do, and it'd be sensible to get someone else to do, but I find that I'm doing that myself. And also I get distracted when I'm looking for crochet patterns as well. So I don't always spend my time doing botanical stuff. Also, the resources I've tended to design and get printed myself. So if you were observant in the picture of my desk, you might see this little box down here, and it's full of some little books. Like I say, various resources that I've designed and printed for teaching. So these are what you would call self-published. So nowadays, if you've got an idea and you want to produce a leaflet or a book, you can literally do it all yourself. If you have any sense of design or laying things out and printing, if you're willing to pay the cost, you can do it all yourself. But it does mean if anybody orders one of these books for me, I have to make up all the little kits myself, literally squirting paint onto these little tester things here, and putting the little envelope together with this little kit, excuse me, and posting it off. So I try and get things out the same day as the order, but yeah, like I said, there's quite a lot of work. We'll come back to those little strips later. So this is the other side. This is the bit behind me in my studio. And so it's really useful storage. It's from IKEA, as you might imagine. At one end, I've got all my drawing boards, and these are paintings yet to be completed, or more likely never to be completed, because this picture at the top has been there a long, long time, 3 or 4 years, I think, and the one below is probably even older, but at least it's not quite completely out of sight. And then these drawers are handy, but it's crazy how much stuff you can have. So I've got a drawer full of coloured pencils. Some of those go back to my childhood, but I can't bear to throw those away. But I've even got a drawer full of tape. So in here, you've got sellotape, duct tape, masking tape, double-sided tape, framers tape. So if you're desperate for some tape, it's third drawer from the left, second drawer down. It's ridiculous. But the trouble is, once you shut the drawers, it's out of sight, out of mind. Drawers full of tech. And here's a drawer full of paintbrushes. Now, I'm the sort of person that likes just to use one paintbrush. And a lot of these no longer have a point on the end of them. And if you're a botanical artist, you know how crucial that is to have a point on your paintbrush. So sadly, some of these will not be used again. I'm waiting for my grandchildren to be old enough to make use of them. And meanwhile, in that drawer, they shall sit. Let's see what else we have. Yes, on top of above all those drawers, we've got books. I don't know how long some of you have been botanical artists, probably longer than me, but when I started out, you didn't have this array of books. This was basically the textbook that I grew up with. And I can see, you probably can't see Carol, but I saw her nodding. How to Draw Plants by Keith West. This was about the only book you could get, I think. But then there wasn't so much browsing on the internet when I started out, so there may have been other things around, and it really was a black and white textbook, How to Draw Plants, and I read it from cover to cover. So we're just absolutely so lucky to have, I'm going to skip back, all these books to choose from. This is just a small amount of my collection, and you'll see here botanical art techniques. You can just see that on the left. That's the ASBA book, and that's a wonderful book if you haven't already got it, with lots of people from the ASBA who've contributed to that, and it's a really comprehensive book. But yes, lots of books to be had nowadays. And then above the books, I've got all these containers, and I'd like to just show you what's in my containers. So I'm just going to find something to show you. So here we go. These are the, I'm not going to show you through every box because we haven't got time. But this is where I keep all my dried stuff. And you'll see here there are things like this, dried rose. And sometimes you have to dry a lot of things to get a good flower. But I tend to keep everything. I've got boxes and boxes of these things. As you'll see here, there's just a little fading tulip. So they're all waiting for the moment when I really, really want to paint them. I've even collected things like posies from niece's wedding. Whether I'll ever get around to painting that, I don't know. And when you dry things, not all of them dry nicely. So you have to dry far more than you think you're going to need. But I'll just show you a couple more boxes. Somebody gave me a whole bunch of peonies. So you can see all these, again, looking faded and beautiful. Whether I'll ever paint them, I don't know, but you can say you saw them here first if I do. In this little box, I've kept some of my favourite bits that I don't want to get messed around with the other flowers. So they're in, let's get this back in focus. Anemones. Anemones I've painted quite a few times large, and they work quite well because they don't lose their petals. And that's basically, if you know your botany, because they're tepals rather than petals. So any flowers that have got tepals or tepaloid petals or petaloid tepals, I don't know, sepals, they tend to keep their petals, they don't fall off. So that's great. So quite often I enjoy doing anemones. I do a lot of teaching. Some of these things like the nuts I will bring out for class. And a couple of things else in here. This is a very old bulb, which I will show you a bit later. But also this one, which I'm hoping that you'll recognise from my painting. So when you've got dried specimens, if you keep them in the right conditions, they can last a very long time, like that bulb there. And hopefully you recognise that from my contribution to the exhibition. I'll just show you a couple of the anemone pictures. This was one I did for the UK SBA exhibition this last year, and I wanted a lot of movement in it, but you can see, like I say, it's fading flowers. I put them like this so they look as if they're dancing around each other, and because they're fragile, I quite like to do the bits falling off, because that's in reality what it's like. In case you haven't already seen these, which you will have if you've been to any of my talks by me before, big fading dead things, big dead things, my friend likes to call these, have been a theme for quite a long time now. And I first started doing these many years ago when I think there were less people doing big things. I wasn't the only one, but it was quite a scary prospect to put these into the RHS exhibition and see what they thought. And like I say, they're all fading things which tend to really, really shrink when they've dried out. So you can just vaguely see the inches on the ruler there and see how small these flowers have become. Sometimes they're almost half the size. So that's one feature, I would say, of fading specimens. They tend to shrink in size. So I decided I would paint these really big, and you can see these pictures here at the RHS. And see, and the one behind me, you can see how big I decided to paint those. Okay, and here, just getting back to actual size, this is the bulb that you just saw coming out of the box, and this is the one that I put into the exhibition. This is actually on natural vellum, and because I was shipping it out of the country, I decided I was going to work actual size, because it was going to be costly to send out anything too big. Before we leave this array of equipment and bits and pieces, I just want to show you this little box here, this blue box here, and it's actually full of my drawings. Excuse me. So I don't, unlike some people, I don't have a beautiful box of, beautiful sketchbooks. I just have a box of drawings, and so I'm just going to show you these. And some of these drawings actually go back a long way, and I've had them a long time, but I can't bear to throw them away. So that little peony drawing I've had for many years, but it's just a good way of keeping things together. But like I said, they're not beautiful sketchbooks like some people keep. But it's sort of each to his own. I think under here I've got yes, there's one of my anemone drawings, and then at the bottom I've also used space for a pumpkin. But I want to explain a little bit why I do things this way, and it's partly so I can just plan my composition, because I don't necessarily want to draw it exactly as I see it in front of me. So I might draw out the bulb separately and then draw out all the flowers separately as well. And in this way, I can play around with how I want the specimen to fill the space while still keeping sort of true to the different elements. I can change the shape of the stem and all that sort of thing, and do that in a range of ways. Let me just show you what I mean. So here is that bulb as is, and I've just was trying to decide what size to do it. So underneath the panel, you'll see this is actually a sheet of natural vellum, because I wanted to try working on vellum, and I've got my panel there, which I'm going to stretch the vellum over, and you can see the bulb is just about the right size for that. And so I've drew all the pieces out on various bits of paper like you've just seen, and then set about deciding how I wanted to fill the space. And my plan was to fill the space as much as possible. So the black line represents the size of the panel, and then the pencil line, the extent of the painting. And you can see that I've tucked this flower, works quite nicely up there. And this leaf is gonna touch this side, and all sorts of things like that. There are other bits to go in. So there's another stem that goes up the top here, and some other bits to go in here. So this is how I will plan my composition. So I'll draw on tracing paper and cut the elements out. What you will notice is that I'm very non-committal about the roots in this picture. I've just scribbled a shape there. And that's because the roots in reality look like this, but I wanted them to fill this corner, or at least reach out into this corner. And so I think as long as you get in the character of something, you can then adjust it slightly. So in the final thing, you'll see I had some roots that were coming, just touching that sort of side, and another one or two going up into what would otherwise be a bit of an empty space there. So I thought we would just have a little look at roots. Roots is something I've done a few times over the years, as you'll see here, and I think it's quite daunting when you're faced with something like this? Where do you start? Because there's just a whole tangle here, isn't there, on the left? And it's hard to make out one root from another. I mean, I would have worked from the real thing, but I'm just showing you photographs of the thing in question. But without sounding facetious, the way to do this is one root at a time, and then it's not quite as daunting. So these ones on the right, these more chubby ones, were much more obvious. So I started by drawing those out in this case. You'd see again the picture on the right that I wanted to extend the roots beyond where they were supposed to go, just again to fill my picture space. And by the way, this background is blotchy on purpose. It's not that I've spilt paint. Excuse me, I'm just getting over a bit of a cough, but I try not to cough too much. Anyway, so I've started drawing out the main roots, and I've ignored all the bits and pieces behind. And then I decided I probably needed to block in some of these roots, because if you look at all these lines here, it's quite hard to tell what's a root and what's a gap, and you run the risk of getting that wrong. So just blocking some colour into the roots like this, fairly basic way, was a good way of then distinguishing what was going to be roots and what was going to be space or gaps in between. And the other thing I did here was actually to put some real darks in, because sometimes these roots seem quite pale, but there's actually probably more colour in them than you think. And by putting some of the darks in, you get it in context, because the pale veins against the pale paper can look, for example, this one here looks quite dark and quite strong, and I thought I'd made a bit of a mistake. But once you have some of the real background darks in, you can just see how the whole thing balances out. So I got the main ones in, and they were the more straightforward ones. And then it was then I had to just tackle all these ones behind. And the way you just do that again is just one at a time. So let's just rattle through that. So I started quite crudely just plotting them out and deciding where I wanted them to go. And then you'll just see here in the middle of the picture that I've started to try and work out where the light and shadows go on the roots and how they overlap. And so, like I say, here it is quite crude, and here it is finished. So this stage between here and here was about working out what was going over and what was going under, what needed to be dark, what needed to be light, and all about the shadows. And on the one that's in the ASBA exhibition, which was on vellum, you'll see again, I did it quite crudely to start with, and then started defining the roots with some sharper colour. And the good thing about vellum is there were times I can see this root here, I actually did too dark, but you could lift some of that out. I was able to lighten that. I just want to show you quite a basic observation of, excuse me, I'm just finding the little thing I want to show you on roots. Now, if you are a sophisticated graphite artist, you're going to be horrified at what I'm about to do, because my shading is just, I'm just doing this really quickly. It's just really just to show you shadows on roots or anything like this. So when these don't have any shadows on, they could just be ribbons, they could be something flat. So if you want to get this looking round, you would put shadow on one side. And like I say, I'm just going to give my excuse my once more time. I'm not doing this in any fancy way. I just want to show you roughly how they would be. So I tend to work with light from my left. So in theory, the right side of these roots would be in shadow, and a little bit more shadow there. And for the sake of time, I've actually sped this up a bit. So you should just see now. Let me just pause that. So what we've done there with those little lines over the top is just shown that the shading now makes these look 3D in form, but there are other things you can do to make these look more 3D. And that is the fact that they might go front and back. They might go towards you, and they might bend forward and backwards. So by doing shading down the whole of the root, you can show this a little bit. Hopefully you could just see, if you sort of squint at this now looks as if it's turning, coming forward and back and forward again. a little bit. Like I say, we're just doing this really quickly because there's so much I want to show you. And then the shading on the other one, if I do that slightly differently, it will turn differently. Now, in an ideal world, I need to give you other clues, which I haven't really got time to show you here. But you'll see that shading and shadow is so key to help your viewer understand what they're seeing. So by having these shadows down the stem, let me just pause that there and just go back. You can make something not only look round, but look as if it's coming backwards and forwards towards you. Okay, so let's just also look at shadows if we have another root or something like that going behind. And I'll just do this very quickly. So if you've got a root going behind, you might have a cast shadow behind your root. And I'm going to just put this in quite straight. And you notice I haven't done any shading on the root underneath. Let's just have a look at that. So if you do it straight, the root behind is just going to look flat and straight. But it's casting, you know, the root is casting the shadow on the one underneath. I'm just going to quickly forward wind again and do a curved version. Now in this version, you'll see that I've very quickly curved. I've curved that shadow now. I'm trying to point at it, but the pointer doesn't show up on your screen. So yeah, that's one way of doing the shadow. Let's just do another shadow. I don't need to dwell on this because there's other things I want to show you. This is just a little observation about how shadows can make or break your picture, really. So if you do the shadow a bit further away and do it paler, you'll see that it creates distance between the two roots. So the one on the left looks very close. The root looks as if this one looks as if it's resting one root on the other, and the other looks as if there's a bit of air between it. So the point I'm making really is how you do shadows does make a difference as to how realistic, makes a difference as to how realistic your picture can be. So just any work that you can do on that, I think, is well worthwhile. Anyway, let's move on. Like I say, the same sort of principle. This rooty picture on the left was a partner to this protea on the right. Same sort of principle. This here was to just do one bit at a time because it is quite complicated. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more about dried specimens. My particular observations are that they're quite often translucent, that the colour changes, and I want to talk to you also about veining. So let's just look at translucence. And I'm going to use these three bulbs as an example to start with. And on this one here, some of the petals look quite translucent up here, quite thin, look as if the light could shine through them. On this bulb here, you'll notice this bit here on the right. Hopefully you can just see my red pointer pointing at it, and it looks quite see-through and it looks quite translucent. And then thirdly, you need to look at this bit on the right where it looks quite papery. Let me just point to that. Yeah, so this bit here looks quite papery and quite thin, and there are other bits up here as well that look translucent. In other words, you can sort of see through them. And it's actually quite easy to paint things like this because once you understand what's going on. So I'll show you a very crude mock-up here. And on the left, I've just crudely mocked this up with my on my iPad. Now, if this bit of daffodil skin was opaque, you would expect the main bulb to cast a shadow on it like this. And you even might expect a shadow a bit under this folded piece. So that's if it was opaque. But because it's actually transparent, the opposite is true. It's much, much lighter underneath than the one on the left. And the bit on the top is slightly darker. In other words, the light from the back is having to penetrate one layer here and two layers of skin there. And here's another example. So you can see this looks really translucent, and that is because instead of being dark inside, it's actually light. And so that's, ladies and gentlemen, all you have to do. You just reverse what you see. You can set up your picture to set up your plant specimen to do this. And I'm just going to try and show you. If I go to my desk now. Oh, doesn't want to. Excuse me, I know I look as if I've frozen. I haven't. It doesn't want to do it for me. Of course, in practice it was fine, and now it doesn't want to do it. Never mind. I always have a plan B. Basically, you need to put a light slightly behind your subject. I'll show you a photo instead. So you can light your subject normally, but you also need a bit of a backlight as well. And that's all I was really going to show you. And that then gives you some translucence on your subject. And here are those dancing anemones again. And you will see here that these petals look quite translucent. So for example, on here, this petal here is quite dark on the inside. It's not looking so translucent. But the one on the back is very pale on the inside, and it's a bit darker on these outer edges, which would normally you'd expect it to be the other way around. And down the bottom here, this is quite a glow in here where this is pale and bright, and then the outside is not quite so much. So that's translucence. And on the top, you can see it here actually particularly well, because this petal is quite pale, and yet the outer edge is quite dark, and you might expect it to be the other way around. So there's translucence. Do give it a go and pose your picture accordingly. Muted colours. So the colours on these things tend to be much more muted than you might expect. And I'm going to show you how I would go about mixing muted colours, because I don't have lots of colours in my paint box. I tend to use just a few. And I'm actually going to go back to those acetate strips, and we're going to start with just 3 colours actually. And I'm going to show you with 3 basic colours, and I'll use the strips because it's a bit quicker, how you can match colours. So when you look at these strips, we've got a cyan, a yellow, and a magenta. And I want to try and mix this sort of the pale green, the back bit actually of this leaf here. And I'm just going to, these strips are graduated. Sorry, the light is sort of a bit in the way. But if I try and mix a green with just the blue and the yellow, I'm just going to get bright greens. So the only thing I can do to mute it down in my, I'm on a desert island, I've only got three colours. The only thing I can do is sort of put a bit of red in there, and it'll give me a much more muted green like that. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to match is this hyacinth bulb, and it's sort of a purple. So I'm going to start with the blue and the pink. And in basic colour theory, I can put more and more pink in, but you'll see it just gets pinker. It's not going to get more muted. I could put more blue in, but it'll just get bluer. So the only thing I can do to dull it down is to put in a tiny bit of the yellow. And you don't need very much of the third colour, otherwise it'll become inaccurate. So I'm just going to wiggle the other colours around as well. Okay, so that's that. And I think I'm just going to skip on a little bit because I want to keep an eye on the time and show you that's me having matched the grey. And I just want to show you the muted colour on the tulip petal. So this is a red. Now, when we're at school, we're told red is a primary colour, and I can tell you it's not, because you can make it. You'll see that magenta, if we put yellow in it. I think we're much more clued up about this nowadays, but you'll see you can make a red with these 2 colours. And so it can't be a primary colour, but it's too bright for our little, our fading tulip petal. So by adding a tiny bit of the blue, sorry, you dirty down those colours. I'm whizzing through this a bit for you. So let's just see that in action with paint very quickly. So here I'm using Permanent Rose, Transparent Yellow, and Windsor Blue Green shade as equivalent to those strips. And you can make lovely purples with these, with the Permanent Rose and the Windsor Blue. So if I had that colour and I wanted to dull it down, as I just showed you with the strips, I could add a tiny bit of the yellow, and it'll give me a nice muted colour, as you can see there. So you might have that muted colour in your palette, but I don't think we need half the colours we have actually. So I'm going to mix the blue now, and this is probably a blue again you were given as a child as a primary colour, but you've just seen me mix it. So to mute this down, I'm going to add a bit of the yellow, and it becomes a much more of a grey green. Obviously, if you put too much in, sorry, grey blue, if you put too much in, it does become a bit too green. but I'm also going to now mix an orange. Now, I should have really changed my water to make this a nice bright orange, but I've done this rather quickly. And so here we are. Here's an orange. So if I want to mute this down, I'm just going to add a tiny bit of the third colour, the blue. And you'll see you get muted colours and browns. And that's really where you're going to start getting your browns from. So mixtures of 3 colours. For all the brown things that I've painted, I don't ever have brown. I don't have brown colours in my paint box. I really just use 3 colours, and it doesn't have to be those 3, to be honest. But I use that with my beginners. If we were in a class now, I'd get you to go off and have a go yourself. Choose a yellow, choose a red, choose a blue, and see what colours you can make of them. Excuse me, So muted colours, it's another thing that you can get your viewer to understand that your subject is faded if you've used muted colours, which I've shown you how to do. Veining, another thing that's very distinctive on fading subjects is the veins. They stand out much more than on a fresh specimen, as you can see here. And the other thing is that they're not neat and parallel and lovely. They go all over the place, they butt into each other, they disappear, they come out the other side. And so you need to paint them like that as well. Otherwise, everyone's, if they're too beautiful, it's going to look like a fresh specimen. So this is your opportunity to use dirty colours and wobbly lines. You want to. And so I'm just going to end our time here before there's time to answer questions by showing you a petal almost from start to finish, so you can see some of the techniques that I love using. And what I love to start with is wet in wet, which if you're familiar, you may know this. And wet in wet, some of this is sped up because of the time. Wet in wet is where you wet an area first with plenty of water. And even though this is sped up, you'll see that I take quite a long time over this. In fact, this is the crucial stage, because this has to be just right to receive the paint, as it were. And particularly little edges and little points, it's really important to get your brush into those spaces and to get a nice even coverage. Now, there is a lot of water on this petal. You can see this is larger than life, but I'm more happy to put too much water on and let it soak into the paper than not enough. And I think if you're used to doing beautiful washes and you try wet in wet, you probably aren't going to go wet enough to start with. This would be too. In a minute, I'll tilt the paper and you'll see what I mean, what the level of wetness needs to be like. But you can see, like I say, even though this is sped up, that I take quite a long time to get the water down, and even keep adding a bit more. It's the points and the edges that are going to dry first, so you need to be really careful about these. Okay, let's have a look. Okay, so you can see there's a real sheen on that. Now, there's quite a lot of surface water on there, so to be honest, I wouldn't put the paint in yet. But you will notice I've got my muted colours all ready to go. So I'll leave it to soak in a little bit, and now I'll tilt it up again. Okay, now you should see there's not really any surface water anymore. There's just a nice sheen, but it's not going dull. Once it starts going dull, you've left it too late, but this is the ideal time to get colour in. So you're going to see me pick up the colour now, and you've got to have the colour good to go. And I like tubes because you can get good colour down straight away. And so what you want is just a little flare on the paper, so the paint goes in and it just flares a little bit. It doesn't go too far. If it's going too far, something's too wet, either the water or the paint's too wet. And I tend to use a sort of little dabbing motion, and that's because the paint only deposits itself onto the paper every time you lift the brush off. So you'll see when I do longer strokes, you don't get the blob until you actually lift the paint off the brush. So you can do little dabbing strokes to get the paint on, but then you can use longer strokes to move the colour around. And as long as you've got that sheen, you can just keep adding colour and teasing things into place. If there was a highlight on this, I would be leaving that white. But because this is a faded dead thing, it tends not to be shiny in the same way. but I'm now just mixing in, and you can see the value of just using the 3 colors now, that I can just pull in colors. You can't quite see the yellow at the top, but I'm just pulling in a variety of colors from pink and browns that I can see. I've got the, sorry you can't see the actual petal, but every time I hesitate, it's because I'm having a look at the petal and trying to decide where I want the color. I personally like to go quite strong at this stage because I want to get as much color down as I can in the first and second layer, because that's going to save me time as much as anything, and it's also going to keep this wetting wet layer really fresh. One of the key equipment pieces that I didn't talk about at the beginning is that cloth, and it's absolutely key to getting the right amount of water and paint for regulating these things on the brush. And I'll just have my brush on it every now and again if I feel there's too much paint or water on the brush. There you go. And sometimes I might clean the brush off just so I can thin the color out. It is a bit of a race against time, but if you do this a lot, it becomes more intuitive. And also you don't have to get everything down in one go. You can just do a little bit. Excuse me, I'm really speeding this up now. And this is because I'm, in real time, this would take me a good 10 minutes. So, and we haven't got that, but you can see this is still the first stage. And that's because I put so much water down, I can start getting these folds. Don't worry about little specks, by the way, because they'll dry out okay. When it's dry and you can see the specks are gone now, you can do a second layer. And that will be to strengthen up areas that, or change areas that didn't work the first time. So you have to put the water down exactly where you put it the first time. Wouldn't it be great if we could work this fast? Okay, so let me just go back to that because the video is going a bit too quick. Okay, there you can now see it sort of at the stage when I've done 2 layers of wet and wet, and it's great because you can already see the undulations. So let me show you what I might do next. So I have drawn some of the veins on. I would draw all the veining on. So this is completely dry now, and now I want to put the detail on. Now, many of you might be horrified at this brush, but I do tend to think of one brush fits all as long as it's got a good point. But you could easily change to a much smaller brush to do this. And basically, I'm following my pencil lines through. And remember what I said, this doesn't need to look too neat and lovely, but what it does need to do is follow the undulations that you've created in the first layer. So if they're not quite in the right position, these veinings really have to follow that line. Otherwise you're going to find yourself the 2 things are going to fight against each other. So like I say, you could change to a much smaller brush, and this has to be really quite dry, and I tend to think that you have to hold the brush on tiptoe really to get these fine lines. So I'm just following the veining. I'm making sure that they go in and out where the shape of the petal goes in and out. And the cloth is off camera, but when I'm dabbing that quite a lot, so I don't get too much color on there. So there are a lot of hesitations where I'm looking at the petal concerned. And like I say, I don't mind if the line's broken, I don't mind if the line's wobbly, and I don't mind if it's not consistent in width, because I think that really helps to describe the fact that this is a fading petal and that it's not in its youth. As I say to other classes, this very much reflects life. If you're like me, you're getting older and things are getting more wrinkled and crinkled and faded. But anyway, enough of that. Sometimes when you do this, it does feel like that this dry layer, which you can see is put on in a much more meditative way, is quite a lot stronger than the background, and it can feel like the 2 things don't go together. So I will show you in a minute. I'll show you how I deal with that. I'm not going to do all this veining on here because, again, we will be here all day. But this is why I like the one brush, really, because when I feel that the two things need melding into each other, I'll use the side of the brush, which I think I'll do in a minute. We'll just put this stronger vein in a little bit. Okay, so by taking some of the brush off, paint off the brush, I can, dabbing it on the cloth, I can just use the side of the brush now to just put small areas of colour over, and I think that just sort of blends what you've got in the background with the detail over the top. So it's really a way of joining the two things together. There's very little colour on the brush, and you don't want it to be too strong. That's a bit too strong, to be honest, going on there now. But I can just blend it in. So I've done the wet and wet background, I've done the detail, and now I'm sort of doing something in between, which you might call damp brush, just to blend that in together. Okay, that's all I'm going to do with that. That's sort of my technique. So I would carry on doing that. I would work on other petals, but that's basically my process for anything I do. I'll start with wet in wet, then I would add some detail, and then if the two things need softening, I would put them together. So I think that's all I want to say, except I do have other things in my life other than botanical art. So you might have noticed the guitar hanging on the wall right at the beginning. In COVID, I did start learning the classical guitar, and I'm quite obsessed with crocheting. So alongside all the dried stuff above me, I have also got boxes of wool. Anyway, where did the time go? I think that's all I've got time to share with you. So any questions? Carol, I think you're dealing with that.
Yeah, we've got a few questions for you, Julia. One of them is, what method do you use for drying delicate flowers?
Okay, shall I spotlight Emmeline, if you're going to ask the questions, I'm going to put us next door to each other, if that's okay.
Sounds good.
But you can change it. You would think by now I would have a good method for drying flowers, but I don't. I literally leave them to dry in the vase. I did some years ago try drying things out in the oven and that sort of thing, but it's almost best to let them dry naturally and see what happens. But you can buy a whole bunch of flowers and you'll only get one that actually you feel is worth hanging on to paint. Or you hang on to them all and you only ever paint one.
Right. And so when drawing roots, do you aim to be exacting or do you take artistic license?
I think you need to understand the character of your plant. So I think I did take artistic license, as I showed you, because I wanted the roots on this to extend much more beyond what they did. But I think you've got to understand the feel of them and the shape of them before you can then go outside. So you might do a little study of that exactly, and then I think you can allow yourself to extend the roots and to change them slightly. So some artistic license. Otherwise, I may as well take a photo, I guess.
And we have another root question from Carol. When you lay out your roots, do you do it in watercolor and don't draw them in graphite first?
No, I did draw them in graphite. I don't know whether that wasn't clear. No, absolutely, definitely draw them in graphite. And then I'm pondering whether sometimes I would draw some of them at the back without, but that's laziness, I'm afraid. I think you should draw them out first.
And for serrated edges, do you do the serrations first or after the main leaf blade is colored?
Okay. I would, if we're talking about the wet in wet technique, it's really hard to show you. And because my desk camera's playing up and we haven't got time. But basically I would wet without the serrations. And then while that's wet, I would put the colour in the, it's hard to describe, isn't it? It's much easier to show. I'd put the, so the blade of the thing is wet, and then I'd put colour into the serration so that it blended in with the wet area, because if you paint them separately you end up with this hard line. You get all these little triangles with a hard line. It's really hard to get rid of that. So if the main body of your leaf is wet, then the bottom of that triangle could then flow a little bit into the water. I hope that makes sense. And then you can deal with the wet in wet, put more colour into the body of the leaf.
And then we have some questions about the filters, the color strips that you used. Where can we get them?
You can only get them from me because I designed them. Yes, I'll just, yeah, I won't spend too long on this, but I came up with them as a teaching aid, really, and they're in the back of this little book. And it's just a really good way of students getting their heads around how colour works. If you've got two primaries, you can mix a whole range of bright secondaries, but to change it, to mute it down further, the only thing you can add is the third primary. I think it's really useful because people will buy and buy paints, and that's absolutely fine. But you can, if you understand how to make colours, you don't need so many. I don't want people to hear me say I only ever use 3, but none of the browns that you see here are only done with like 3 colours, and the whole painting I might have used 5 or 6, no more than that.
So we had a question, somebody asking whether you always work with the permanent rose, transparent yellow, and the Windsor blue. So you mix it up with 3 other colors?
I do mix it up. I didn't have time to show you another little video where sometimes those 3 will change. So I might, if you know Daniel Smith colours, I might use quinacridone gold. I've got an old tube which used to have a nicer recipe. Quinacridone gold was like the yellow, Mayan dark blue, which is like indigo, was my blue, and then still permanent rose. But the thing I want to say about the blue, the Windsor blue green shade, is there are very few blues that don't granulate, which don't go all bitty. And that's fine when you're not doing wet in wet, but if you're using wet in wet, what you don't want that granular texture on your painting. And Windsor blue green shade is one of the only ones that doesn't granulate, and so I'm quite devoted to that one as a blue.
And what is the brand of your table?
Do you know, I'm really sorry, but I couldn't find the paperwork for that. So I don't know. I'm really sorry. You need to look for I mean, obviously I'm in the UK, you need to look for a stand and sit table. I think even IKEA do ones. This isn't IKEA, but IKEA do ones that go up and down. Even one that have, they have a hand crank. And
is there any one book that you can't live without and you would suggest with a botanical artist?
Okay, well, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Depends what you want. Now, if you want to be inspired by other people's paintings, I would get one of the Shirley Sherwood books. Of course, I'm not going to be able to find one quickly. So if you can see this, when I started out and there was only that one book, the next one I got was a Shirley Sherwood book, and it's just full of the most inspiring paintings. So I think that's great. If you're asking me a couple of books that I wish I'd written, it would be a Billy Scholl book, which is the little square one with a rose on the front. I can't find it quickly enough. And the other one would be one by Ishik Gunnar. I don't know if you know her. Again, I think her work is fantastic, and I think her book is fantastic. But I also think the ASBA one is very, very comprehensive, and you've got the input from lots of different artists, because different artists do work in different ways. What I'm saying to you is not the way of working, it's my way that I've developed for painting and teaching. So yeah, and that's off the top of my head.
And how can we order the books that you've self-published and your strips? Yeah,
now the shortcomings of self-publishing is that you can't get this on Amazon. You can only get it from my Etsy shop, of course, which I think is just Julia Trickey Art. You'll have to go to Etsy for that. Yes, but be aware that I will have to put everything in an envelope and get it to you. I ship as promptly as I can, but actually it's getting across the water seems to take a long time.
And where did you get the vellum that you used for your bulb, for your 26 candle?
There's the one reputable place in the UK is Cowley's. And anybody that uses vellum in this country will get their vellum from there, and they're very good. But I think there are places in the States. So I don't know where the nature of the question, where the person who's asking the question is from. But Carol paints on vellum. So if it's somebody in the States, she will tell you. Is it pergamon? I think this
Pergamena is one that ASBA really, a lot of our artists love. I know Carol works with Pergamena.
Yeah, but Cowley's definitely in the UK, and it's a very small concern, but as in there's not many staff, but they love their work and they love supplying artists with vellum.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. I think that about covers all of our questions that we have from the audience. Thank you, Julia, for an incredibly detailed talk, and it was great to see your studio and all your knickknacks and treasures that you've kept throughout the years. So I am just going to share a little bit about some of our upcoming programming with everybody. So next Thursday, November 16th at 1 p.m., journal editor and designer Margaret Saylor and I will host an artist talk with Laura Silburn. Laura will give a closer look at her story, Voice and Vision, Exploration of an Artistic Practice, published in the September 2023 journal. Laura will share details on her fern project, her process for building a dynamic composition, and rendering the details of a fern. This will be a 1-hour session with a Q&A, and the session will be recorded and available to registrants for a week after airing live. You can register at asba-art.org under Education and Event Calendar. We hope you will join us for Laura's talk. And thank you all for attending this talk with Julia. Thank you, Julia, again. And thank you, Carol. And we hope to see you at future programming. Thank you all and enjoy the rest of your day.